Okay, let's get started. Let's do another depressing presentation. So as you might see from the title, it's not a happy one, this one as well. So sorry about that. So first, because thanks for introducing me, by the way. So, yeah. So my name's Viljami, or Antti Viljami, as I call myself in the social medias. So I'm kind of known for being an anti-digitalist guy, for mostly my Twitter contributions to Koodi Klinikka stuff as well. But yeah, I've been called a Forbes featured hacker for some reason. I got featured by a blog on Forbes for exposing a Chrome bug, basically. But that's just ridiculous, doesn't make any sense to me. But what I do for my day job is APIs, a lot of DevOps stuff and some open source advocacy stuff at Futurist. But yeah, enough about me. So what makes me able to talk about APIs is that I've been working with them quite a bit. So right now I'm working on microservices for Kesko, and it's a bit of a work in progress still. So if you're seeing bad experience from Kesko, don't blame us yet, because we haven't quite gotten stuff done. But basically what that is, it's just hiding hard business problems behind simple APIs, right? It's so simple and easy. All right, so also I've been doing some volunteering work at API Ops, which is a nice community of API related stuff as well. And I've been doing some live stream stuff, live coding APIs from scratch. So if you want to catch that stuff, that's me there not knowing what I'm doing. But yeah, 4-hour, 5-hour live streams of just me coding an API from scratch. But cool, so why should we even talk about bad APIs? Well, I guess that was the other presentation where we were talking about a bad framework, a kind of a failed thing. Because we learn, and also it's fun and makes me feel better about myself, because I do bad stuff as well. Right. But honestly, it just helps you avoid those mistakes that other people have made. So, stories. Just a disclaimer, I'm not talking about my clients here. You can't point to any API that this is Kesko, or this is some other client that I've been working on. Hopefully, I've tried to obfuscate that as much as I can. But yeah, just a disclaimer for that. So the client says, we have these APIs for third-party services, but we would like you to build new ones on top of those, which is a bit suspicious already, right? Because you already have APIs. Why do you need more? Why do you need APIs on top of APIs? It can't be that bad. It's probably just integration stuff. Some orchestration logic, because it's microservices. All right. So let's look at the first one they want us to do. And it's SOAP. We love SOAP, don't we? Everybody loves SOAP. So yeah, I'm not a big fan, but at least I know SOAP. I've been doing SOAP stuff before. And absolutely no documentation available anywhere. But everybody knows SOAP APIs are self-documenting, right? That's good. Right, so that's the first problem I want to talk about. So missing or incomplete documentation, that's a huge fail when talking about APIs. You want to have documentation. You should at least have a README where you can have a few example requests that you can run. That would be nice to kind of just get started. Well, it's SOAP, so we have the WSDL. So we should be able to use it anyway. Even if you don't have any documentation, we have the description of the API. Well, we can't see the WSDL. So it doesn't look like a SOAP API. So that's the second problem we had. It turns out the API is actually behind a gateway product that doesn't fully support SOAPs. So we're not going to get WSDL from the gateway. So what's the solution? We'll just email you the WSDL file. Right. Because APIs never change. That's good. Yeah, well, it's not optimal, but it's okay. We can still work with that. We can just change it when we need to. So, time to set up a SOAP client and use the WSDL to explore it. That's the cool thing about definitions like with SOAP or Swagger or those kind of standards, because you can actually have clients that are able to look at the API and explore them automatically. Cool. I'm going to use SOAP UI. Oh no, that doesn't look good. So it turns out my SOAP client doesn't work with the WSDL file they sent me, or any other client that I could find, which is a bit weird. So looking into it, it turns out they just, well, they had the error message that actually quite useful. It said, target namespace already in use by another schema, and it turns out there are two schemas with the same target namespace. And that's in the SOAP spec that you can't do that, but for some reason this API did. And so, here's a solution. Let's just merge them manually, because we have the WSDL file now. We can just go and like open up Vim and do it. It's fine. Not optimal, but workable. So finally, my SOAP client is set up and I can start exploring the API. So let's try this method called lookupMember. Looks like a pretty basic getter. So SOAP UI gives me this example request that I should be able to do. And guess what happens when I try? Oh, good, 200K. But not quite what I expected, right? Well, so null pointer exception. That's not very useful for me. I try to get something, and I get a null pointer exception. And I can't access the code of the underlying backend. So, couple of problems there. You probably shouldn't return 200 OK when you have a null pointer exception. The second problem is that as an API consumer, null pointer exceptions or other things that are related to your programming environment aren't very useful. I didn't even know that you were using Java. I didn't want to know, I didn't need to. So we had to ask for help. All right, what that says. So we emailed them, asked them to help us. So it took 3 days, about 6 emails to get to the person who knows about that API. This was a third-party vendor, so that wasn't like our client. But we had to go through our client and then get to the vendor, and then we were put in contact with that person from the vendor that was able to give us an explanation of why this is happening. And they were able to give us, oh yeah, well, that's a problem. It's quite hard to get help. But they gave us an example and it worked. So the problem was that only the root element supports the namespacing that SOAP UI gave us. So they defined example requests for us that didn't work. So they defined that we should be using namespaces here. But turns out they can't do that. Fun. But now it works. So we get something. We get a person with a UUID and name, email, birth date. Yeah. So next thing to do, we want to try a setter. So we're doing like basic CRUD stuff, creating and updating things. And it worked. This was the first time we tried something and it worked the first time. This is so cool. However, the problem with this response is that now if I want to know if my setter worked, because I'm setting stuff, now I have to go back and use a getter to get it again, to just check that my setter is going to work. So that's kind of annoying. But, well, it's called a chatty API, and it's kind of just annoying to do that sort of thing. Just too much traffic. You don't want to do that. But fine. Again, we can just live with that. So moving on. And we know, this was not specified by the way, but we know that there shouldn't be two people in this database, in this service, with the same email. So just to try it, what error we're going to get, because we don't have any documentation yet. So we want to try what happens, so we can handle it in our code. So I use a setter, we send a duplicate, and 200 OK again. Well, this is a pattern that we've learned from this API. But couple of things wrong here. Can anybody spot what you would do differently? Right, again with the Java errors, like SOAP service fault is not something that's very useful to me. It is like machine readable though, so that's good. But then, like, that's Swedish, isn't it? If I remember my high school Swedish, that's Swedish. Bad error messages. So just generally don't do Swedish. US English, a lot better. So would be nice to have machine-readable error messages so that you can handle those easily in your consumer code. But yeah, pakkoruotsi, I mean, that was cool. For the first time in my career, I got to use Swedish. It's not for nothing, guys. Okay, let's try one more. So, get member by UUID. So another getter, something quite simple. This time we're just going to get a member. Instead of just using ID, we're going to use the UUID. Should be simple. Seems to work. Wow, cool. Can anybody spot a problem with this? Last time I gave this talk, somebody actually did, which was surprising. It's not clear. Well, here's the thing. That was wrapped in result, and the other method I used was wrapped in return. So you can imagine how many hours I spent debugging why my code is not working. But yeah, it's a minor annoyance, but still, don't know why. Inconsistent API responses. You want to have your responses be similar to each other at least. Okay, time to look another API. Remember, we're doing adding APIs on top of other APIs, and the client has a lot of third-party APIs and services they want us to build on top of. Well, they say it's a REST API, and well, everybody knows if your client says you're going to work with a REST API, it's never going to be a REST API. They think it is, but it's not. And it turns out they have Swagger documentation, and that's kind of cool. That's kind of a new thing, isn't it? And you want to have that. And I can even use like Swagger UI to explore the, well, this is the pet store. Let's call it the pet store API. But yeah, I can have a look at different endpoints. I can get example requests here. I can even try those requests. That's awesome. Like, it can't be this easy. Well, let's explore. Let's do get pet 1. Okay, okay. Looks good, looks good. But I don't really like the data structure. Like, well, that's just a bad model. If you, well, why would you do this if you can just do this? That's 3 lines. This is how many lines? And it's the exact same information. There's no benefit to doing this, at least in this instance. That's just annoying. So moving on. Try a setter. So we're going to post a new pet. And what's funny is the post method actually gives us this structure. They don't demand us to use the weird other thing, but that's fine. I like it this way. 200 OK. Status queued. So we get a UUID. So what happened to Garfield? Garfield is some queue, in some queue somewhere, just waiting. They gave him a number. Well, we don't know which ID, because we know IDs are like numbers. They're not UUIDs here. It's not supposed to be UUIDs. So, looking at this Swagger documentation, we see there's something called the pet queue. So we're going to go look for Garfield in the pet queue. So we have the UUID he got. So, let's see what happened to Garfield. He's cute. Thanks. So this is the async way to do things. So we're just going to have to poll this queue, wait for Garfield to go through the queue, and then... Well, it makes sense if you have something like a really big workload that you have to do, but this is a setter. Like, I don't care. I'm adding a pet in a database. It shouldn't be this hard. Well, it wasn't a pet. It was actually, in that API, it was a person, but still. Shouldn't be that difficult. Well, now I need to poll this endpoint until the insert has finished. So, a couple of minutes of polling later, job done. We still get the UID, but this time we get a result, and we get a pet ID, which was what we were looking for. Now again, it would be nice to see the pet here. Now we have to do one more request. And we get this annoying data structure, but it works though. I'm quite happy with this. So imagine putting this in our API. Now we have to handle this as well. But at least it worked. So well, I'm not going to go to why this had to be as async. There was really no reason for that. It was just, that's the way the developer of that system liked to do things. But the last thing we want to do is we want to list some pets. And you remember the ID, by the way. We got 50,232. So I'm guessing it's about 50k pets in the data store. So let's do get pets. Okay, it's doing something for quite a while. Nothing's happening. Gateway error. Connection to backend timed out. Curious. So I have a hunch that this might have something to do with the number of pets. Yeah, 50k. So it turns out if you don't specify a limit, it'll just try to give you all the pets from the API. And it takes a while in this database. And we crashed the API, by the way. We had to call our client and tell them, sorry, the developer environment is now down. Can you do something about that? Yeah. So another problem, you should have default pagination, because most data stores have more than 10 items in general. Okay, that was the story. So quite quickly now, what did we learn? We learned why our client wanted us to abstract these APIs. And we learned the world is full of shitty APIs. And I want you not to make any more, please. And here's how. Please have examples. Provide executable examples users can type directly into their terminals to see working API calls. That's a good practice. Get a README and try to run the example code. You can't go wrong with that. You want to describe your API using standards? Now, both of these APIs actually did use standards, which is good. But I've seen loads of APIs that don't. So GraphQL, Swagger, well, I'm not sure if RMAL and Blueprint are really good to use anymore, because Swagger kind of won the API definition wars now. But yeah. And even WSDL if you're a SOAP kind of person. Java people here. Yeah. So this we saw as well. Return appropriate HTTP status code. That makes it a lot easier to handle errors in my code. See Wikipedia for that. It's not too hard. You want to generate useful errors and not Swedish errors. Or Finnish, for that matter. You want to avoid making chatty APIs. So a good thing to ask yourself is, does your API serve its purpose in as few requests as possible? I think that's a good way to design APIs. Try to make them easy to use and try to make them fast to use as well. Keep your API responses consistent, really important as well. There are standards here. Models, you don't have to overcomplicate things if you don't, you don't have to. Even if your database looks different, you want the API to be as simple as possible just for the sake of the users. And there's something called schema.org that tells you how to structure certain models, like most common models like addresses or what else is there? I don't know. URLs, that sort of thing. So if you use coordinates or anything, there are standards that you can look up. So pagination, we saw that. It's probably not a good idea to provide endpoints that will crash your service, unless that's something you want to do. You generally not. If you don't test it, though, I mean, why not? And I think this is the most important one. Just if you're making an API, make sure it's easy to get help, because I mean we're going to make mistakes. But the thing is that you want to have somebody that can help the person using your API. Should be you, preferably, but even if not, include some contact in the API itself. And yes, developers are people too. You're building an API for a human. So how do I then make a good API? Well, just avoid those things and read. Here's some suggested reading that I'm going to leave here. And if you guys have any questions, I'd love to take them. That's
Questions?
Go ahead.
You didn't happen to have any solution for the async problem.
Yeah.
How to avoid the polling.
Right.
I know you can, of course, provide a notification to some URL, but then the caller would have to set up his own HTTP server, which is a pain too.
Yeah, so you can't really avoid async. Like, sometimes you just have to do that. Especially when you're using HTTP as the transport for your APIs. But the thing is that use async only when necessary. In this instance, the reason I was kind of annoyed with it was a setter, and they could have just responded that, okay, we have received your data, and this is how the data looks to us. We didn't really care what happens after that, so fire and forget.
What's your opinion about that? Would you prefer having to poll or having to set up an HTTP server to get a notification?
I haven't actually thought about that. I would like to minimize the amount of requests, so I would say polling is usually, well, not preferable, but I do see how it makes it simpler as well for the developer, so I don't really know.
This describes a lot like my life.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yes,
Peer support.
But how can do you have advice how you can make your customer create better APIs, like how to make them
Right.
follow some
Magic. Yeah.
I don't know.
Because, well, your clients are going to buy their APIs from somebody else, and just make them buy from somebody who's going to.
No, they're making theirs themselves.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Good. So maybe in that instance, you would go talk with the developers at your client and talk about what you want with the APIs.
Yeah.
Just talk with them.
Or you can ask Viljami to come to talk for money.
That's also
for your
very
client.
true.
Okay,
Hi.
I think the 7 emails in 3 days sounded familiar, but those were low figures, I think.
Yeah, it's in the low end.
Sometimes
That's
it's
true.
more, yeah.
That's true. But in this instance,
I think in more general sense, it's often about like no one's responsibility area. Like the client works with companies A and B, and they do their stuff, like almost up to the point of having examples or something. And then who will pay for the shit job?
Yeah.
Then the one who has to work with the API or in the integration or whatever. Maybe it's just something that the party that says, okay, we'll just use their API, has to always like put some extra hours to them. So this was not actually a question, but if you have something to comment on, I'd like to hear.
So I'd like to remind you that, like, who are we building APIs for? And I'm talking about APIs from like a product perspective. So the product's going to build APIs for the client, right? Because the client wants to use them for something. And the client's going to have developers who are humans. So I would say you should remember that APIs are supposed to serve the consumer always. And the consumer is usually a human.
Can you tell an example of a crappy API endpoint you have made?
I have made, right. So I made quite a lot of, like, in the past, I think. I've made a lot of shitty PHP stuff that didn't have any specification. It was just post something to this and then something will happen and I won't tell you what. And that's a common thing I would do. Didn't know better back then, and now we have Swagger, now we have REST API specification and that sort of thing. So I think things are moving forward as we understand what microservices are for and what benefits they give us. It's not just using it in some software.
Is there still some questions? Yeah, one.
Okay.
So
hey,
about the error messages. So I don't know what's the exact question, but what do you think is the good kind of like a middle road between telling enough about what went wrong and not then exposing kind of like a security information that can be used kind of like the wrong way?
Yeah, so I definitely don't advocate for like just passing error messages through your libraries to the end API consumer. That doesn't make sense to me. So like with the different definitions, you would usually define how the payload looks, how it's supposed to work, and how it's supposed to respond. So in the case of like I'm going to send a payload that's not correct, like in the first example I sent the wrong payload to the API. So it's actually quite easy to use some library that's going to enforce that definition. So you would have something before it actually goes to the API to look at the payload, does this format looks correctly? And that's going to handle 90% of all your problems already. And then just try to handle errors in your code. Like, you're probably going to see some errors while you develop stuff, and you want to know that, okay, so this is a common thing that's probably going to happen. So this is the kind of error we're going to return. But that's it, really. Just use the HTTP status message, because usually it already helps quite a bit just to give the whether it's the user problem, so a 400 error message or a 500 error message. That's already quite enough information. So as a consumer, I would know if it's my fault or if it's the API's fault that something's gone wrong.
Thank you.
Okay, still one.
Cool.
What do you think about response sizes? Because now when we have GChip and everything, that is it good to provide like these monolithic responses instead of like responses that can be split to like smaller chunks?
Yeah.
I once made this application which communicated with this Rata API, which tells like train information and departures and such. And I asked the API that, please API, could you tell me like the trains that leave from Helsinki station from 30 minutes from now on, and it gave me 10,000 rows.
Yeah.
And what do you think about it?
So. Right, so that's a totally really common problem, and when we have like open APIs, they tend to be like Excel files, so just dumps of, I don't know, JSON or CSV or something like that, and you get the entire data set. And I think that's wrong. That's definitely wrong. So the API should be such that you can ask for the information that you want and just not get everything all the time. But then there's also the question of if you actually want a large data set, so how do you actually go ahead and do that? And that actually depends on who's your consumer. So if it's a browser, what you actually can't do is you can't make the browser wait for like a gigabyte of data, usually. So you have to stream that in some way. So you have to use some socket or something. So it really depends. But yes, there should be ways to get even large amounts of data from APIs. And well, a good pattern that we've seen in our microservices, for example, is just get an endpoint that asks for an export, for example. So I define that, okay, I want an export to this S3 bucket, for example. And then what happens in the background is, well, it's the async thing again. Then I can ask if this is done now. So that's one way of doing it, if you have a really large data set.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
Hey, thank
Awesome.
you.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Here's your hat, dude.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool.